All right, guys, let's see what kind of trouble we can get into today with some of those special effects. All right, one of the things that came up actually yesterday, so I'm going to come back so I'm not just talking to a blank screen for you guys. One of the questions that came up yesterday when I was talking with one of the phone techs was, can I manipulate a vector converted design the way that I can my lettering? And my immediate thought was, well, no, it's not lettering. But after I thought about it for a minute, the answer is actually kind of yes. So the design that came up was just converted lettering. It was straight across, and she wanted to arch it the way that she would with an envelope baseline or an envelope line type in her normal lettering. And that's completely doable. So let's take a look and see how to actually do that. So what I have here is just a digitized, it's a bunch of column 2s actually, digitized piece of wheat, I guess. If it were green, it could be considered a piece of laurel. Doesn't matter, you can make a wreath out of whatever, or a kind of just a band of whatever. And just like with lettering, so let me put my name in here. And if I change my line type to envelope, I can right click and create a curve, and I can arch this so that all my verticals stay vertical, but I've got this nice arch. And that's something that we can do with this embroidery element as well. It's just done a slightly different way. So let me go ahead and start setting this up a little bit. I'm going to rotate this 90 degrees. And then I think I want to flip this. I think it's going to look a little bit better that way. I'm going to duplicate it. I'm going to move this guy over. And then I'll mirror it the other way so that I've got two pieces kind of pointing to each other. And now if I select just those pieces, and I can scale this up a touch, I can go to Object, and then Transform Outline, and I get those same type of outline elements that you would with an envelope line type, where I've got a straight point in each corner, I've got this line across the top, I can modify this line all I want, so I'm going to right click in here, I'm going to drag this up to about here. This is going to stretch out my elements quite a bit, probably not what I'm looking to do, but if I right click on the bottom and drag this up, maybe not quite that far, I can make the bottom line match a little bit. Or if I go back, so let me undo. There we go. So let's go Object, Transform Outline. So I have that. I can bring these pieces in a little bit, say about there. And then I'll do the same thing here. So you can kind of skew these guys, bring this up, do it again, bring this up. And now I've got these kind of going around, so you start building a little bit of a wreath, and then you could flip this, and you've got a good amount of flexibility with what you're doing. And then if you wanted to make a full wreath out of it, you could rotate it back. Now, because it's kind of done like the envelope line type, it deals with horizontal elements a little bit more neatly than anything else. So when I'm doing something that is initially vertical, I will flip it to be horizontal before I start setting this up. So you can start to develop pieces that way, and that's just with that transform outline. Another piece that's, let me delete this, underneath your object menu is the shadow effect. So if I turn this on or start to use this, this will generate a drop shadow, and it's asking all kinds of good information about, you know, what do I want my drop shadow to really be? You know, what angle do I want? What's my offset? That offset is kind of how much of a drop shadow, how thick do I want it to be? And then what is my overlap? And the defaults really are pretty good, so I'm pretty happy with that. So let me get back into Design Shop and hit OK. And now it has generated a drop shadow for me. And if I take this out of 3D, what I really like about this is you can see that it is cutting out that stitching from underneath. The other thing that's pretty fun is if I move my lettering, it will change the drop shadow with that lettering. So if I don't like how it's set up, I can move it around and it will still generate that drop shadow. It's still satin stitches, but it will sort of knock out underneath wherever my top stitching is. So those are some two kind of pretty handy ways to manipulate some of your wireframe elements. By the way, that shadow works not just with lettering, but it would work with wireframe elements as well. So that's pretty fun. I could throw that drop shadow under that laurel or wheat just as easily. Other things that you might consider doing is to start to use some of the decorative stitches in Design Shop, or even create your own. And some of that is level dependent, but let's go look at what we can do with that. So in this other document that is just pieces that I was playing with yesterday, I have a ton of different elements that I may want to repeat. But how this works, let me go back to this blank document, is if you have, I'm going to put just a walk stitch up here, and then possibly in a better color so you guys can see it. There we go. And then I'm going to put a fill down here so you can see the difference in how these two act. And if I go into, let's fit selection so we can see what's going on. Here we go. All right, so if I go into my stitch type, I can change my walk normal to a walk decorative. And what that does is it takes just this little motif and it repeats it along that path. And those decorative elements can either be satin stitches or walk stitches. You've got a lot of options with the pieces that make this up. And there are a ton of patterns in the software already that you can go choose from. So I could do leaves that follow along that path, and that's just a bunch of little walk stitches that follow along that path. So that's a walk decorative. It goes just along that path. You can do the same thing with a fill. You can take it to a fill decorative, and right now it's got those beads repeating. You can change the pattern for that as well. So let's do those leaves again so that you can see what that looks like. And if you don't like how those are lining up, you can go in and change the spacing just by dragging those handles. One is kind of the spacing, the other is kind of the offset. At least that's how I think of it. Let me see if I have the real words right. No, of course I don't. It's spacing and vertical spacing. But you can change those with those handles to get that looking kind of just the way you want it. And that can be really kind of interesting and fun. Let's undo a couple times and go back to those beads so that I didn't mess up any of the spacing. Let's go to Snowflake, I think. Yeah. And then let's adjust the spacing. Now, when I start doing this, you'll notice that I tend to start nudging things with the keyboard commands, just so that I can have things starting to line up exactly the way that I want them, and I'm not so great just dragging my mouse. If you guys ever want to just barely nudge something on screen, you have the ability to do that via your keyboard. You highlight either an element or an input point. In this case, I was grabbing a handle. And if your cursor is in the view window, if you hold Shift and hit the arrow keys, it'll move 1 point or 1/10 of a millimeter at a time. If you hold Shift and Alt, it will move 10 points or a millimeter. If I hold Shift and Control, it will move 100 points or a centimeter at a time. So that's a really nice way for me to try to line up very kind of tight things when I'm not so handy or steady with my mouse. Perhaps I've had one too many cups of coffee. This is decaf today. But if I get a little shaky, a little bit clicky, nudging with my keyboard really helps with that. So that's a handy little tool for you guys. All right, let's go back and look at this. And while this is up here, I want to show you kind of a couple of other effects. These are really fun effects. They can really mess with a standard fill sometimes if you go a little bit too far, but they're really fun with decorative fills. If I right click and I go to Properties, I can go to Effects, and then I can go down to Distortion Effect. And I have a bunch of different options here. You can do a double waved, perspective. We talked about some of these in one of the blending sessions, but the ones that are really fun with this particular pattern are radial out, which makes it look very spherical and very cool. Radial in, which makes it look kind of like you're being sucked into a black hole. That's pretty fun. But if you want a little bit more control, you can go to double waved. Double waved kind of treats the interior stitching the way that we were just dealing with lettering with that envelope line type. I can move these points, so I can go crazy this way, crazy this way, right click, create a curve. You can really start to distort how these stitches behave and get all kinds of crazy waves in here. And if you go the opposite direction, they'll start going closer to each other, getting tighter, farther apart. But you can really see or start to see some of the distortion that you can get in there. If you do this very, very subtly, you can get, with a normal fill, a nice kind of slight wave, as if you were doing flags, water, anything like that. This can be really handy for fur effects. The sculpting of kind of that musculature of any animals that you might be doing. Go a little bit crazy and the stitches start going a little bit longer. They start crossing over each other. With a decorative fill, since you're dealing mostly with, in this case, walk stitches, you've got a little bit more flexibility before those stitches start crossing over each other and being a little bit weird. This can be incredibly, incredibly fun. All right, so I'm going to delete that, and let's look at how we would create our own. So there's a ton in the software, but depending on the level of software, you can create your own. So that would be done just creating a little piece of a motif that you might like to see over and over and over again. Now, when I set this up, you might find sketching on a piece of graph paper super handy. I do that. I use vector elements in Design Shop all the time, and I get one kind of like I think I would like it, and then I'll duplicate it and move it to the side and start it right where the other one ended, just to make sure I really can do a continuous pattern the way that I think I can. I'm not always that good at it. So when I duplicate that, then I can kind of tweak it and nudge it until it looks right before I ever have saved it as a decorative. It's kind of like doing a sew out of your embroidery design before you send it to your customer. I will kind of test it with vector pieces repeated over and over again by each other to see, do I like this look before I create the pattern. So let's look at this kind of Greek key piece here. I'm going to copy this and I'm going to just put it into this blank document just so we can see what's going on. I'm going to center this real quick, and I'm going to put the crosshairs on so you can see what I've got going on. Now, one thing that is very, very important when you are creating decorative stitches, because those elements have to follow along a path, I'm developing this upon a horizontal line. So I don't care if it's the center line, I don't care if it's just a Y coordinate that you choose, but your start and your end needs to occur on that same horizontal line. Otherwise, as it goes, that pattern will start to have weird jump stitches in it as it jumps back down and starts the next piece. So with this Greek key, I have my start on the lower left, my exit on my lower right, And then I've even gone so crazy as to make sure I can see my input points, and I will select that starting piece, and I can see that I am starting, here at negative 114. You can see the same thing here. I'm ending here at negative 114, so I know that those are lined up. Once that's done, once you have your piece kind of set up, so you can see as I draw this out, it's moving all in one direction. So. There we go. I can select that element, and it doesn't have to be just one element. You can do it with multiple elements, but let's start with one. I can then right-click, go to Save as Custom Shape, and then I'm going to save this as a decorative. And typically when I do stuff just to keep track of what I'm doing at work, I put my initials before it. You guys can do whatever you want. So I'm going to label this my initials and then Greek key. I'm going to hit OK. And then let's go, new document. I'm just going to grab a walk stitch, come across. There we go. And then I'm going to change this. Fit window. I'm going to change this to a walk decorative. It's going to default to that bead, but now I can go down in my list and I can see Greek key. And now that is repeating perfectly across that. Now, because everything was so rigid and perfectly square, it might get a little bit dodgy on a curve, but just like stitches, the smaller your element is, just like the shorter stitches follow curves better, shorter elements follow curves better. This is a pretty big element, and honestly, it doesn't do that badly. You can kind of see the transition here, but you've got the whole straight element here, and then it repeats again. But straight across, sorry, there we go. Straight across, I think that's looking really, really, really nicely, or working really, really nicely. If you knew that you were going to have a more curvilinear element where you had a bunch of swirls and curves and things like that, using a more organic shape or curvilinear shape can help hide any of that. So let's look at doing that with one of those pieces. Let's go grab another piece. Not out of that, we're not. There we go. So these pieces, either of these would work well. I've already done this one. This one's a little bit interesting in that I start here and I exit here, even though it comes back, it'll walk back and exit here to reattach. I'll show you that in a minute. Let's use this piece to do one. So let's go back to here. I'm just going to delete that piece and put this in here. All right, so this one I'm setting up basically on kind of that 0 mark. So I want to start, I'm at 0. Let's make sure I exit on 0. So what's that exit point? 0. Okay, if it wasn't, had I had my exit point here, I can move my exit point over so that it's on 0. And that's what I'm really looking to do, so that where the last piece starts, the next piece, pardon me, where the last piece ends, the next piece can start. And you'll notice that this is a combination of walk stitches. Why is there a trim there? Because I didn't move my entry point. That's important. So let me move this over so that it generates its own travel, and I can delete that, and we're not generating trims in the middle of our designs. That's a little better. So I'm going to grab this. I have it all selected. I'm going to right click on it, go down to Save Custom Shape, and I'm going to save this as, again, a decorative. It's going to allow it to kind of follow along that path. And I don't know, it's kind of a wing. Hit OK. And I'm going to duplicate this. And I will change this to wing. Let's put that into 3D. That is really kind of fun. It follows along that path, and if I were to curve this, it would do well. Now, one thing I want you to look at, and it would be better if this were pink, so you can see the blue lines a little bit better. Notice that it's following that blue line, And that blue line is cutting through those elements exactly where my start and stop were. So my start and stop here were on 0. My start and stop on the key were on that lower edge. And so it's following along that lower edge for that one. So keep that in mind as you're developing these. If you're making your own, that it would follow that edge. Now, I said I had done the other one, and I would show it to you. So let's go down and go to Swirl. So that's that other piece. And how the pieces interact with each other kind of changes. So let's take a look at these. And we'll put them kind of beside their elements. There we go. I'll move this guy up. So you can see with the key, it kind of loses itself and starts to repeat the pattern in ways that sort of hide the start and stop. The wing, a very easy place to see the start and stop. Each element is very, very clear. The key, it's hard to tell where the element is. And with this little swirly guy, it is also kind of hard to tell. So you've got a lot of flexibility in how you set these up. All right. You could also do it with walk stitches. We've got little elements here. And then I think this one's pretty fun. So let's do this again, and I'll show you why I did it. So I'm going to delete that. I'm going to put this in here. I'm going to center it just because I want to be sure I know what I'm doing. Right click, save custom shape, and I'm going to save it as a decorative. In M, I'm going to save this as cube, plural. Now that doesn't look like a cube, and if I were to go into this, and let's duplicate this and move it down. There we go. And then change this to cubes. It really doesn't look like cubes. It's kind of fun, but it doesn't really look like cubes. Well, if you find a pattern that works well horizontally and you can pattern it vertically, you can create a lot more dimension that way as well. So let's look at that, only this time instead of using a walk decorative, we're going to use a fill that's a decorative. So I have this selected. I'm going to change to decorative. And as soon as I do, you'll notice that it takes your underlay to none. It's because you probably don't want a ton of underlay when you have a ton of negative space in your fill. And I'm going to change this to NM cubes. And this is close, but it's not lined up exactly the way that I want. So I'm going to grab that handle and I'm going to nudge just over. There we go. I think that's about right. So it starts to create kind of that cube pattern where it looks like, is it going forward, is it coming back, all that kind of good stuff. Now, if you really want to mess with it, you can go in and apply one of those effects and go really kind of crazy with it and really start to distort things. So again, this can be really fun, add a lot of dimension. This is looking like it's coming really, really forward in space. The other thing this allows you to do is digitize a relatively small piece, such as this. Lost track because of all my windows. Delete that, put this in here, I'll center that back up. And again, the key is that my start and my end points are on the same line. All right, I'm going to right click and save as custom shape. I'll save it as a decorative. And then I have no idea what to name this. Curves and angles. I have no idea. All right, so let's go back in. I'll take the distortion effect off of this. There we go, so we're kind of back to normal. And then let's go back in and we will change this to curves and angles. Now this looks kind of fun and kind of wavy, but if I begin to tweak this, gotta think about this a minute. Come over. And then come down a little bit. You can digitize a relatively small piece to create a rather large pattern. If I were to rotate this 90 degrees, there we go. So you can create this nice pattern, and you can do this over something else. If I make this a nice gold, and I create a single line border with it, and then I'm going to put a fill underneath, and you guys are going, wow, what did you do? Because you just clicked on things and things happened. I'm using change element type. I'm just using a keyboard shortcut to do it. But now you can create kind of interesting patterns over colors. So in this case, it looks like wallpaper, but you could be doing this to create scales on a dragon, or scales on a fish, feathers on a bird, any kind of things like that. Or this can be really interesting if you had like a mascot that you wanted repeated inside of the letter for a school. You could have like the outline of the mascot or a paw print repeated throughout that M or H or whatever that big shape is. Another way to kind of add dimensions to fills is, instead of using a decorative fill, you can use a pattern fill. And those are located under this little icon here, the Select Stored Patterns. If I click on this drop down, I can then choose what I want to do. I like bamboo because it's kind of fun. Now, when I do this, typically I like to see a little bit more dimension, and these patterns are being created by lining up needle penetrations. So if I make my thread kind of gray, I take it out of 3D, and I turn on expanded editing mode, or actually just view expanded stitches, I'll leave it in wireframe. You can see that all those needle penetrations are what are creating that pattern, but you've got a few extra needle penetrations inside the form. So inside this piece, you've got them here, here, here. And to eliminate that, that's because the stitch type is still set to fill, but to eliminate that, what I have the ability to do is change my stitch type to satin, and it will pull out those. And then if I look at this in 3D, that pattern really starts to come forward. So when I'm using a pattern fill, it is very common for me to change my stitch type to satin just to better show off the pattern that I put in that fill. Now, you can select any of these patterns that you would like. Change that up. I'm going to turn this back off so you can just get the pattern. Pardon me. But you have the ability to create your own, because all these patterns really are, they're just a repeated split or hole or fill island. Not so much a hole, but you can turn a hole into a pattern like this. It's just repeated. There's a checkbox for tiled. You check it and you can do it. So let's go ahead and do that, and you can create your own. So let's just take this back to no pattern. And then to create your own, I tend to have my elements selected. I will click on Insert Hole, but instead of hole, I will select either a split line. I typically choose a fill island, especially when I'm starting to repeat a pattern like this. And then you can digitize your shape. And it doesn't matter what that shape is. So I'm going to digitize, I don't know, this. Typically I put a little more thought into this, but we'll see. So I've got that. I'm going to change this to a split. No, I'm not. Not when I have that still selected. So I'm going to deselect that tool. I'm going to select just that fill island, and I'm going to change that to a split. So now it's just a split, and then I'm going to tile it. And then you can begin manipulating how you want those patterns to overlap. So you can get some kind of fun designs that way. Just be careful with this one in that all of your needle penetrations are lining up. So it can start to pull a little bit of a gap there. What you can do is add a little bit more underlay. You can also, if I have that split selected, and if you have an open split where it's not just a shape, it's a little bit hard, if not impossible, to select it on screen. Just go grab it in the project view and then you've got a hold of it. You also have the ability to blur your outline. So it'll blur it a little bit, so it's kind of there, kind of not. That's pretty fun. You can alternate your split, which does essentially every other line. So you've got that option as well. Now, this too is something that I'm kind of rubbish at if I'm not really planning it out. So I can try stuff and it doesn't always end well for me. So what I'll typically do is I will create a vector and again, kind of repeat that over. So let's look at how that's set up. Now this one, you don't need to make sure that you are starting and stopping on the same line. Doesn't really matter. But I've got two pattern fills here, one here and one here, and you can see those shapes. They started out as vector elements because I wanted to see, okay, if I duplicate this and I play around with it, you know, what do I get? Keep having snap to grid on, and my grid is currently set to 1/4 of an inch. So those are huge jumps. But you can kind of start playing with this and getting ideas of what does this really look like when I start repeating it. Same thing with this piece. It's over here. Now, how do I get this vector element into this? Well, I copy it. So right-click, copy, edit, copy. I did Control-C. And then whenever you go to paste, or whenever you go to use any of your tools, really, but I'm going to grab, again, this fill island. I'll do a split. You have the ability, instead of using an automatic custom shape, if I click and hold for half a second, you have the ability to use whatever's on your clipboard. So I'm going to grab what's on my clipboard, I'm going to come into my fill and I'm going to double click, and that's going to paste it at actual size. I can click and drag and do all that, but it's going to be not at actual size, and since I worked so hard to get this the way that I want it with that vector, I don't really want to change the size. I'm going to come in, I'm going to select that split, I'm going to go tiled. So that's looking pretty good, but man, my spacing's off. So then I just have to figure out my spacing, which takes a little bit of time for me. Sorry guys. Let's bring this off. There we go. And then I think this is closer to here. Oh, I know what my problem is. And it's a good thing that I had this problem when I'm talking to you guys, because this is something that would eat my lunch typically. You'll notice that this line is completely not showing up because it needs needle penetrations. Well, if my stitch direction line and my splice line or split line have the exact same angle, they're never going to show up. So let me try that again. I'm going to delete this split. I'm going to change my angle to 90, and then I'm going to do it. So I have that selected. I'm going to come in, I'm going to grab my clipboard shape, I'm going to double click, All right, and then I've got to turn off all the tools I was using, select my split, come over here and say tiled. That's so much better. And then I think it's about here. Come up, a little more, over, there we go. So I had my spacing just about right before, but I wasn't able to see what I was doing because I had that split line that lined up exactly with my stitch direction line, and that just really doesn't end well for me. If you want, you can save your own pattern fills. So if I really like the way that this is going, I can right click on it, go to properties, and then I can save my fill as a specific name. Yeah, and that's one way that you can have them pop up in here so that you have access to it a little bit more frequently. So you've got a lot of tools available to you with kind of giving your designs a little bit more pop. Hopefully I've given you a lot to think about and you've got a lot of tools to play with now. So I encourage you to just go play with it, see what all you can do with it. Yeah, if it doesn't sew out great the first time, that always happens to me. Go back, edit it, and play some more. It's a great way to add a lot of dimensions and further your designs. So have fun with it, and I will see you the next time. And hopefully I won't have nearly as many problems getting online.